do that. Father God, thank you for the opportunity to be with these guys, for a meal together, for fun, for chat, for seeing who we are and how we are. I pray you'll guide us as we go through this material tonight and think about what it means to be your people living in a world in which it isn't always easy or popular, especially in our West at the moment. In Jesus' name, amen. The interesting thing, I think, for me is that Being the Bad Guys was Christian Book of the Year, shameless plug, but 2021, wow, that's like 4 years ago, nearly, but a lot's happened in 4 years. And Being the Bad Guys, and we'll look at it tonight, I wrote it about, wow, things have changed for Christianity in the West in the last, over the last decades, but it presented itself in the last 10 years in a very interesting and slightly hostile way for evangelical Christians in the West in particular. But the last few years have been churn as to where things have changed up again. So next week we're going to look at my second book, Future Proof. How do we pitch ourselves going forward in what seem to be much more roller coaster years? Where's the culture going? What's going to happen? But it's one thing to think that the future looks like a cable car ride to the top of, I don't know if you ever saw the Jetsons TV series. We had the Jetsons. In fact, George Jetson would be 3 at this stage. He was born in 2022. And the future looked smooth. Work looked like whatever you wanted to do. There's a lot of leisure. AI wasn't as pernicious as it is. But it looked like the future was going to look like that. And if you strap yourself into what you think is a cable car ride to the top of Progressive Mountain, and you end up on a roller coaster where what event is coming next, what disruptor is going to change things, you'll get a little bit nauseous. And I think we're living in a period like that culturally in the Western world at the moment. There's a lot of churn and there's a lot of seismic change. So what I want to do this week is look at the Being the Bad Guys stuff. How did Christianity get to be a little bit on the nose culturally, especially around issues of identity? Next week we'll look at the future-proof stuff. How do we navigate it with joy and, that would be a good idea, and love and compassion and confidence. And the third week I want to look at the vibe shift in the last few years, even the last year. Culturally, there's things going on. Christianity seems to be suddenly a little bit popular with some crowd, but yes and no. What's going on? There's a vibe shift, definitely. And we're sitting in the middle of it going, which way is it going to go next? That's what we're going to look at over the next 3 weeks. So I did write Being the Bad Guys, How to Live for Jesus in a World That Says You Shouldn't. That sounds a bit of a conceit for Westerners living in a place where if you go to Town Hall in Sydney, the building next to it is St Andrew's Cathedral, right? So who says we're persecuted? It's not quite the same as if you were living as a Christian in somewhere like sub-Saharan Africa in some countries, for example, where things are difficult. But there has been a movement in the last couple of decades where certain aspects of the Christian faith, and it still happens at legislative level, Christian schools, for example, struggle to figure out how to do Christianity in the public square because they keep getting on the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald. How has it gotten to the stage it did? And what I noticed as a pastor was that for many years I was saying to people, well, go out into the workplace and be, a good disciple of Jesus and have those water cooler conversations with people about Jesus. But what I started to hear back from people was it's much harder in the workplace and much more hostile. Go speak to the HR department before you start talking about Jesus at the water cooler, much less invite someone to church on a Sunday night on the odd chance they might hear something that is very offensive to them, and on Monday, you're walking past them like your old girlfriend, because you're a bit embarrassed about it. How did it get to that stage? And what I realised was I was a bit behind the times, that the modern world for the average person was pretty tough in the workplace as a Christian on certain areas and certain topics. And there was a less margin to talk about Jesus before you got asked harder questions than you really had the answers for. We'll come to that in a minute. But I took the title from a great movie from nearly 30 years ago called Falling Down, where this is, William Foster is the main guy in this movie, and at the start he ostensibly starts off as the good guy, pen in top pocket, driving to work, carrying a briefcase, and through a series of unfortunate events, ends up with a load of guns, chasing around. It's American movie, but there's a police officer played by Robert Duvall who's chasing him down during the day because he knows that this guy's causing trouble. And eventually he gets to Venice Beach. So the sun's going down and they're on the pier at Venice Beach. And William Foster's got his hands in the air like that. And Robert Duvall, his character, is pointing a gun at him like this and say, "Come in now, William, come in. There's some police officers here who want to speak to you. They're good guys." And the look of discombobulation that comes across William Foster's face. And he says, "You mean I'm the bad guy? How did that happen?" And in one sense, I thought, yeah, I think most Christians I meet can remember a time when to be a Christian was a bit lame, but it wasn't sort of, you're the problem in the culture. And something shifted. And for many of us, especially of those of us, such as myself, who were kind of in the Christian work bubble a little bit, we didn't pick it, didn't see it coming. And you go, "You mean I'm the bad guy? You mean we're the problem in the culture? You mean you don't want us to come alongside you and help you? You mean I'm not the chaplain to the state anymore?" That's the feeling and tone that started to come across. I was speaking to a bishop in Victoria who's an evangelical guy, and he said, this is the year before last, he wasn't even phoned up and asked to come to the town's memorial for Anzac Day. And he said, oh, wasn't asked. It's like, yeah, we're kind of done with that, you know. We can do the greater love hath no man than to lay down his life for his friends without the church. We'll take it from here, thank you very much. So at one level you've got hostility going on, and at the other you're going, we're done. We don't want that. And that's the direction we're going. Part of the problem of that, I guess, was we're supposed to go out and tell people about Jesus, you know. And part of the problem of that is that the kind of responses we get and the kind of questions that people ask these days are a lot different to what they maybe were 30 or 40 years ago. Now, I love thinking about philosophy, and I love great American philosopher poets, and here's one of them. And this is Mike Tyson, the young Mike Tyson, not the Jake Paul version. And he said, everyone's got a plan until they get a punch in the mouth. Everyone's got a plan until they get a punch in the mouth. What do I mean? What did he mean by that? He meant that everyone's got an idea of how they're going to respond to a difficult situation until the first smack in the face discombobulates them. And I think as Christians, what's happened, and I noticed it, was it's maybe 30 years ago people used to say, well, do you believe in dinosaurs? That was the test of whether you were actually, kosher as have you a scientific understanding of the world, you crazy Christian, you? And you go, I believe in dinosaurs. You tick, you're all okay. It seemed to be the question, the science question was what people asked. And that's kind of neutral at some level. It's not a deeply hostile engagement. So you thought, well, we've got some common ground here. We can talk about these things. And that's how it was. No one gets asked the dinosaur question now. I guarantee that. It's not the primary marker, I think. Because what you're waiting for if someone says, are you a Christian, is, they're going to ask me a really difficult identity or sexuality question. And this is the city to ask it, right? Even notice the difference in this city compared to, say, Perth. That identity question around sexuality, what you think of this, is to the fore. And it's not just that question, but it's moved from a, science question to a deeply philosophical personal identity question. And you can answer this one in the negative. No, I don't believe in dinosaurs. And they just think you're an idiot, right? But you answer this wrong, and it's not neutral. You're getting at the very core of someone's being. And that's, I think, where we've struggled as Christians to figure out how to answer that question. And the tactic has been, let's delay answering that question for a very, very long time. Hey, look over there, as you do. And here's some I prepared earlier, but I'll tell you a little one about myself in a minute. how did it get to the stage where I felt like I got a punch in the mouth? So, a lot of the issues we're dealing with, I think, are not the high point or the low point of some of the sexual revolution stuff that's been coming up in the last 50 years, which itself is based on 200 years of French philosophy, basically, the whole ethical issues of change. But I think what's at the core of a lot of this is who gets to determine what a human being is and what a human being is for. It's not a dinosaur. What's a dinosaur and what's it for? It's what's a human being and what's a human being for? And so when you answer those questions, they're deeply personal for people. And you're always thinking, I feel one wrong answer, one misstep away from breaking a relationship somewhere or getting the proverbial punch in the mouth. Not literally, I would assume, but you know the feeling. I have 5 brothers. I have an identical twin brother who doesn't have a beard like this. So he's like me in every other way. They're not Christian at all. At all. I have another younger brother who's a Christian, who's in his mid-40s. I have another brother again, he's in his early 40s, and I have 2 half-brothers in their 30s, early 30s. So whatever you want to say about the sexual revolution of the 60s, it took a chunk out of my family along the line, right? It's not like no one escapes. We're swimming in it, right? And my half-brother, my older half-brother, so it's the number 5 of the 6, was getting married to a South African. I'm married to a South African as well. And so he said, can you MC the wedding? I said, yeah, I don't want to do the wedding. He doesn't want me to do the wedding because, it's going to be hard to MC. I tried to assure him of that. It's easy compared to doing the wedding, but I didn't have to do the wedding. And at the reception, I got it all planned out what I'm going to do. I'm going to jump up from my seat, these lovely, long, beautiful tables with, strewn with all the funky looking stuff, very hipster wedding. And then Jennifer, his wife, and her family, a lot of them had come over from South Africa, and her brother and brother-in-law with their surrogate daughter had moved to Perth, and they were coming to the wedding, and they were sitting at the table that we were, and we hadn't met them, my wife and I, and there's her brother and his husband, married in South Africa in 2016, and this is in 2017. Now, what vote did we have in 2017, right? Plebiscite, right? Hot issue. Very hot cultural issue. And they're sitting opposite us at the table, and the first thing you ask someone at the table, well, what's your name? Bayers, Leonard, Jill, Steve. And what's the second question you ask? What do you do? Do we have to? And I go, far out. I just want to have a glass of wine or a meal. I don't want to punch in the mouth, And I was pretty honest. I said I'm a used car salesman who sells, because that seemed a lot better than I'm a pastor of a church, right? Because I know what's coming next. And that's what came next. From 2 guys who didn't know me, who knew I was their next brother-in-law's brother, half-brother. Man alive, that's just, do the maths. I can figure it out. And I knew what they were going to ask next. And that's exactly where Leonard went. Can gay people come to your church? Oh. And of course, the answer is, of course you can. That's not what he's asking. It's not what he's asking. So I set myself up in the way I responded to a punch in the mouth, I think, because there's another way to answer that, which I'll go into a little later. He's asking, in the place where you say truth and God is found, where you do worship as a community, can I be could I leave it a Bible study? Can I be involved in the music? Can I do it? Do you have a barrier to that because of... And if you'd asked that, it's like, how do you answer that with 4 hours to go to a wedding, right? Now, Bayers was smart enough to see where it was coming, and he headed off the pass, which is okay. But everyone's got a plan until they get a punch in the mouth. And I'm Mr. Talk a lot, and I'm Mr. Well-read, and I was struggling, right? Because I thought, how should I have answered it? And we'll talk a bit about how you might answer those questions afterwards. But part of the issue for me was, I think evangelicals who got a great apologetic framework and have always been prepared to give a reason for the hope that's within them. You do it with gentle. It doesn't matter how gently or reverently you say, no, you can't be involved in our church because, that's not how it's going to go. And it made me realise that in the cultural moment we're in, we're not in the power position anymore. Here's two things to remember about that conversation with Bayers and Leonard, and it struck me. If we'd gone to a wedding 30 years ago where Bayers and Leonard were lovers, they would have presented themselves to as cousins or friends because it was an away game for them and a home game for me. Guess what? That's flipped. It's a home game for someone who can look at a pastor in the face who he's never met and challenge him at a wedding. That's how things have changed. That's why people are discombobulated when they get asked that question. It's an away game for us, which tells you, and we'll get into the away game, that the stance you take in the conversations you have are no longer, I'm here to say this to you about what we know. So I think in the conversation with Bayers and Leonard, that would have avoided that kind of hostility if the next question had been asked. I've thought our apologetics as Christians has often been, I've got an answer for you, rather than saying, maybe I should ask Leonard, what's the question behind your question? What are you asking me? But I don't have to get there immediately. I can say, I should have said, so that's interesting. Do you go to church? Have you had an experience at church that, but just keep asking questions. And I think one of the things we need to think about in our apologetics in the modern age in evangelicalism in the West is we need to start asking more questions to see what's going on in the lives of people underneath before we then come forward with an answer. Not that we don't give an answer, but I want to know, why is that question being asked? Where's that coming from? What's his experience? Maybe he had a bad experience at an evangelical church which turfed him out in South Africa. Totally possible. It made me think, but the away game, home game thing, absolutely critical at that point. It's just where it's going. And you know the difference if you're a soccer fan. Anyone support Arsenal? You put your hand down. Get him out. Get him out. Yeah.
No, Man U.
Get him out. Where's that slide? Yeah, there we go. I feel sorry for your losses. But if you say, we'll pick the other team, the other Manchester team, Manchester City. So if you're an Arsenal fan and you're down at Arsenal's stadium for a home game and you go into the pub and you stand on the table and you drink 2 pints. Well, I wouldn't do that. That's what Arsenal supporters who are ungodly would do. Because it's a home game. You can flex at a home game. You go up to Manchester City's Etihad Stadium and you try that as an Arsenal supporter, you get on the bang, because it's an away game. One of the biggest issues for Christians in the modern West at the moment is how can we cope emotionally with the shift in stance? Because in my book I write a lot about the anger that comes out from, we should have it our way again. You go, well, maybe, but is it going to happen by you getting angry? Or despair? Let's head for the hills. I do a lot of talks in the hills and I say, let's buy 5 acres and, beans, spam and shotgun and say, I'm there already, But I assume in this crowd that's not quite the case. So you get anger and fear as responses to the changes that are going on culturally. And a whole bunch of people in the middle who are a little bit, what do we do? I think that's where we're at. I think Bayers and Leonard showed that to me, who was well read and well thought out about these things. And then you see people with their job on the line. And look, there's a vibe change. Mark Zuckerberg is proof of that, right? you know. Looks like he drinks full cream milk in his coffee now, but and he's changed his stance on things for whatever reason. But we remember this, though you're not an AFL city so much. This is Guy Mason from City on a Hill Church in Melbourne. This is Koshi on Sunrise. And the guy behind him is Andrew Thorburn, who was Chief Executive Officer of Essendon Football Club for how many days? One day. He used to be the Chief Executive Officer of the NAB Bank. NAB. And somehow, the Purple Essendon group, as it was called, got wind that he was an evangelical Christian who went to Guy Mason's church and was in fact the head of the board. And that they then dug around and found sermons from 10 or 12 years ago when Guy was starting the church, which spoke against life issues like abortion and sexuality and homosexuality, but long before Andrew Thorburn ever got to that church. And it just blew up. And he resigned. And Guy goes on Sunrise the next day to explain that Jesus is all about life and love. And what Koshi heard was, Jesus, because he just wasn't listening to that, right? He wasn't having that. Now, I used to watch Doctor Who when I was a kid, and I was scared of the music. And I would hide behind the couch like that. And when that was going, as I was watching Koshi sort of smack into Guy Mason, I was... And Guy came and said, well, Jesus is all about life and love. And Koshi said, how can you say that when lots of other Christians around the world don't believe what you believe? And you see, Jesus is all about life and love works amazingly well on your church vision day. Doesn't cut any mustard on Sunrise with David Koch. And he got a hammering. No, I'm not going to blame Guy too much for that. But when Guy started his church 12 or 13 years before that, he was also on Sunrise because they were an uber funky, cool church meeting in a pub down in the Docklands of Melbourne. And it was a puff piece. 12 years later, bang, the same guy interviewing him, the same guy. And Guy got hammered. It was such a significant event that Tim Keller was the last article he wrote, one of the last articles he wrote before he was really sick, was about this issue and how Guy might have responded differently. And it kind of unpacks, how do you stop, when the punch in the mouth is coming, how do you respond to something like that? And part of the issue for what I'm saying in my book is, it's going to take some time for us to realise that we are in an away game. Now, it doesn't mean to say we have to apologise things, but the stance has to be, you've got to have situational awareness where you're going. Now, the interesting thing about it is that part of the issue we're dealing with is that the people who are the loudest in the culture we're in, especially in the media, are the most secular people in the country. Now, apart from the exception of David Koch, who does go to church, his wife is a member of a church in Sydney. Many of the media have no clue about church. So you're not just dealing with anger towards what Christians might believe and think, you're dealing with ignorance about why we believe it and how it's put together in an ecosystem. So after this train wreck on Sunrise, all the media decamps down on the Sunday morning to Guy's church to see what the crazies are doing, clearly, right? You should read the reports on Monday. It's like they're in leather jackets and jeans driving so expensive. What did they expect? Amish in buggies, going to... Yeah. They had no clue. So what we're dealing with culturally is a hostility towards what I think you Christians believe about these sexuality issues or gender or whatever, or your exclusivity about Jesus, and an ignorance generally in the cultural moment as, decline occurs across the church. And you do see people not just, look, Andrew Thorburn was there for a day, but I'm kind of guessing he's got a little bit stashed away for a tough time. but you might not. And that was the fear for many people. What if in HR tomorrow someone comes and says something to me? And that's how people feel. And that's what happens. So, and part of the issue is that the Christian framework about what it means to be human is now viewed as there's something transgressive and toxic about it, especially the first chapters of Genesis. So David McCarrath was a doctor in the UK who demurred when asked to use pronouns. Now, I'm not going to be here nor there on whether you should or shouldn't. I think in the medical field, you need to be smart about how you go forward. But he lost his role and he was brought before a tribunal to which he appealed. And this was the statement that was made by the tribunal in finding against him. Belief in Genesis 1:27, lack of belief in transgenderism and conscientious objection to transgenderism in our judgment are incompatible with human dignity and conflict with the fundamental rights of others, specifically here, transgender individuals. Now, all I want to say about that point is that so often in our Western world, Christians have said, hey, you know those human rights you got them from us. What it means to be human. Go back to Genesis 1, made in God's image, created by God. Male and female, he created them. All your human rights issues, they didn't come out of thin air. And this is exactly the opposite. Actually, Genesis 1:27 is actually hostile to human flourishing. That's a big difference. Whatever you think about the use of pronouns or recognizing someone's stated sexuality, the panel was saying Genesis is the problem, not part of the solution in our culture. And that's coming at a time when we, have for decades in our apologetics as Christians have said, when we hear, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. We go, no, it's not self-evident. It's in the Bible. That's where you get your human rights from. And it says, actually, we don't like those versions of human rights. What you're getting at the moment is, and you've probably heard of the term queer theory. It simply means queer being in the word for transgressive. No one in our culture is trying to tear the whole thing down. They're just saying, instead of the foundation stones that built our culture that you've got holding up this edifice, instead of that foundation stone, Genesis 1:27, how about we put this foundation stone in? It's a reconstructing of identity across the board, across how we do life, how we think human flourishing works, what we think relationships are about, how we view ourselves. And that's been the flowering of several hundred years, as I've spoken before. There's a great book by a Melbourne pastor, it's a few years older now, maybe 8 years old, Disappearing Church. From Cultural Relevance to Gospel Resilience. I think 20 years ago we thought if we meet in church in a pub, people think we're pretty cool and hip and urban. And they'll give us a hall pass for all the other stuff. Let's be culturally relevant, like me, And then we realised that that isn't helping our people. If you're going to traverse the post-Christian framework in the West today, you need some gospel resilience, because what we experience and what you see all the time is someone gets to the age of 17 at church and they've done chubby bunnies at youth group for years and they're doing the Bible studies. They get to university and they're gone. The gospel resilience stuff isn't there because they know they're stepping into a place where it's not just an away game, it's Premier League versus, Division 10. The philosophy lecturer sees them and, fresh meat. Anyone Christian here? You're done. And so Mark Sayers, who wrote this book, said, we've taken the wrong attitude to this. We need gospel resilience first. And he's from a hip urban, Melbourne church. But he says this, I'll explain this in a minute. The idea that second culture values of faith is what is described as the culture of the Judeo-Christian framework of the book, the religion of the book. And he says you can have a searing understanding of the culture, You can have a encyclopedic knowledge of all the things that matter in our modern day world. But if they get a sniff that you hold to orthodox Christian views around gender, sexuality, and identity, he says you'll be viewed as beyond the pale. So you can't sort of line up on I'm culturally hip and urban, and we meet in a pub, and they go, yeah, but you suck. You're homophobic bigots. Those are the words that silence us because we don't know how to respond to them. Oh, no, I'm not, which just sounds like, oh, I'm smiling and friendly. You were just like the smiling Nazi. That's what happens. Not everywhere and in every place, but enough that you think, how did we get here? And that's really, how did it get to that? Because it feels like it happened quickly. Is there a map to how we actually got to this location? There's a great book called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self by Carl Trueman. Has anyone read it? Has anyone got it, pretended they're reading it, and it's so thick and heavy and, yeah. There's a Cheats Note version of it called Strange New World, yeah. And Carl Trueman says, how did we get to the state we're in? The rise and triumph of the modern self. Because culturally at the moment, the primary identity marker is not community. It's not a tribe, it's you. And anyone who speaks to your psychological self in a way that could damage you is being hostile to you. Which is why when we say, but they're just ideas, they're just words. No. It doesn't work that way in a psychological age. You've got to remember that aspect of it. And here's what Carl Trueman says. The intuitive moral structure of our modern social imaginary, I say that 10 times before breakfast, right? It just means the water we swim in. The water we swim in our modern culture, he says, does a number of things. And I'll unpack this. I'll spend a bit of time unpacking this. It prioritises victimhood, sees selfhood in psychological terms, regards traditional sexual codes as oppressive and life-denying, and places a premium on the individual's right to define his or her own existence. Now, let me unpack that for you. The intuitive moral structure of our modern social... The water we swim in, the cultural at the moment, especially the media culture that frames and shapes our modern urban settings, prioritises victimhood. What does he mean by that? He says, the voices that got dialed down in the past, especially by Christian shutting them down, their voice needs to be heard because you created victims. You isolated this minority group. You rejected this minority group. You tried to change this proclivity in this other minority group, and look at the damage you did. It's time for you to shut up. And look, there's truth to that, isn't there? I think we all, especially my age, I can think of the person in my church who was a sexual minority and they struggled to have friends, to know what to do or how to, whether there was a place for them at church, and it was, And this is saying those voices need to be dialed up. And at the time that Christians are going, hey, we're a minority group too, they're going, really? St Andrew's Cathedral is next to Town Hall. Your schools cost, 5-figure sums to go to, and that's without the .00 on it. It's like, whoa, you've got everything. You can't call yourself a victim. You run the culture. Even the way we do non-Christianity as Christian, you're not a victim. And we live in a world of what we call intersectionality, where if you can show how many levels of minority-ness, you get further up the totem. And Christians aren't on it. Now, the beauty of that, Sam Chan, some of you may know, Chinese. It's very hard to argue with Sam Chan because, he's Asian. So he can speak about Christianity much more than... I'm pale, male and stale. I don't know if... I hate me more than you could hate me. You see how that works? So the voices that get dialed up, and you've got to shut up because you had your say. But the intuitive moral structure of our modern social imaginary sees selfhood in psychological terms. This is the key issue where we look at it today. We believe in a word-based, thus saith the Lord moment. We believe in the Bible and it's God's word. It's proclaimed. And words are dangerous to people today. That's what half of the issues in your HR department are about. I did not feel safe when they said those words, but they're just words. We say, no, nothing's just words anymore. It speaks to my deep psychological self, because my psychological self is my true self. Now, let's bring this back to the sexual identity questioning. My wife is a clinical psychologist. And look, you can say what you like about the sexual revolution, but it's built us a great house in Perth because, you know, she is booked out, right? She hates it when I say that, but I said I was going to say it, and she's going to hate it again that I said it. I'm being facetious, but the psychological age that we're living in sets the agenda, right? 50 years ago, if you're going to see a clinician because you felt you had gender dysphoria, and so here's your, you know, manly physiological self, flex, and here's your psychological self, and you feel like, I feel like I'm in the wrong gender. I feel like a woman. I don't feel like that, and it presents that way, but I don't. The clinician's job to make you whole again, to make you true again, was to move this in that direction. Which way is it now? It's the other way. Because your true self is your psychological self. Who you are inward, expressive individualism, your role is to find out who you truly are and express that to the world. And your inner self is your true self, which is why words are so damaging, which is why gospel words are so damaging in one sense, if that makes sense. But they're just words. No, they're not just words anymore. They're weapons against my true self. Which means when I invite someone on Sunday who's at work, I have to think, is the minister going to say something that is going to do damage to that? That's how they're thinking anyway. It suddenly becomes a risk. The intuitive moral structure of our modern social imaginary prioritizes victims, sees selfhood in psychological terms, regards traditional sexual codes as oppressive and life-denying, and places a premium on the individual's right to define his or her own existence. Now, that may be the modern way of looking at it, and you think, well, you know, but that's 200 years of French philosophy. Man is born free, but everywhere finds himself in chains, Rousseau. What chains? The city and the government and its institutions and how we do modern relationships. And you don't have to read Rousseau for that to be the water you swim in. You just have to sing Frozen songs. Because the point of your life is to find out who you truly are inwardly and break away from the oppressive structures that would stop you being your true self, that would see wickedness as an actual thing rather than wicked being something queer that has been suppressed, that needs to be released. And the voices that pushed it down need to shut up. That's the cultural moment. I'm not saying don't go see Wicked, right? Go see Wicked, enjoy it, sing songs of Frozen. But that's where we're at culturally, I think. Now, the interesting thing about the book, it says it's called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. The modern self is propped up by my wife's clean psych practice and thousands like it because there's something missing. We don't know what's going on with ourselves. It's the age of anxiety. We'll deal with that next week. It's like the rise and failure of the modern self because no matter what prop you put on it, it keeps falling down. It cannot stand in the cold, harsh light of reality. And you can't translate it well to sub-Saharan Africa or the Middle East in the same way that you can in an urban setting in a Western world, which have all of the ropes and pulleys to keep it in place. That's just the culture we live in. Your point in your life in the Western world is to find out who you truly are inside and express that to the world. Now, A great example of how that plays out, Caitlyn Jenner. This is going on like 8 years ago now. But Caitlyn Jenner was Bruce Jenner, the 1972 gold medal winner at the decathlon in the Olympics, and always struggled with gender dysphoria. And is an interesting character as a very conservative Republican who goes to church. And Caitlyn Jenner, in the same life, was Man of the Year and Woman of the Year across a 40-year period. That's huge. It's a huge shift in how we think about what it means to be human. And this isn't to bang on about sex or gender. It's just it's about the internal psychological self. And in Vice magazine, the day after Caitlyn Jenner was plastered all over Vanity Fair, this statement was made, and I want to explain this. The moon landing, the fall of the Berlin Wall, once in every American generation comes a moment that changes the world forever. For millennials, that moment came last night. And I want to ask the initial question, seems funny. How can you compare Caitlyn Jenner, Bruce Jenner coming out fully as a woman, as Caitlyn, with the moon landing and the fall of the Berlin Wall? Seems a bit dumph, you know, but it's not. Let me explain. The boomers. Any boomers here? Wake up. No, sorry. These are the front row. Sorry, that was really rude. It was really ironic because I'm an ex-gen. Yeah, so. The moon landing, truth was out there, wasn't it? It was out there. The split infinitive of Star Trek, to boldly go where no man has gone before. We're going to search out there. It's Scully and Mulder as well. Because that's where we're going to find out who we really are. So in Star Trek, for example, you didn't go to the other planets and discover more about aliens. The job was to discover more about humans. That was the point. Gene Roddenberry, who wrote it, said that was the point. The truth's out there, and you'll discover it as you go on the big exploration out there. The first interracial kiss on American television was between Lieutenant Uhura and Captain James T. Kirk. And it had to be out there because America was so fraught still with, you know, it couldn't be in a suburban sitcom. To be out there. The fall of the Berlin Wall. Ex-gens? Anyone? Ah, Danny, I see that hand. I remember it, 1989, and it felt like all the walls were going to fall down. The truth's there. It's across there. We will knock down all the tribal walls. Will be this one new world order. The Berlin Wall will be the dividing the east from the west is going to fall, and the walls will fall down. And it seemed to go okay for a while until it didn't, right? It feels like since then we have taken the rubble from those walls and built smaller tribal walls around micro-tribes. That's part of our problem. We don't know whose toes we're stepping on at any given time. If you can't trust out there, you can't trust across there. The locus of meaning and purpose is in there, which is why it says for millennials, and even they're getting on to 40 these days, so I think that there's been a change again, and we'll talk about that in the next couple of weeks, about the generations below. For millennials, that moment came last night, which is ostensibly the search for identity is within you, and you can choose to shape yourself how you wish to be, including loosing yourself from the surly bonds of your physicality. It was the big break between who you think you are internally and this meat package that covers you. So what we've discovered in the last 10 years is there's a huge issue about the body, and even the trans issue is a stepping stone to transhumanism. If this world is as bad as it is, and you cannot get rid of the racism, the misogyny, the ableism, and all those things, the best thing to do would be just get the psychological self and dump it into a cloud somewhere and get rid of the body. That's our hope, which doesn't sound like much hope to me. Certainly not resurrection hope. And we have a resurrection. Now, I'll skip a slide here because we're coming up to 20 past. Are you having as much fun as I am? Yeah, that's right. You're stuck listening to me. Just want to go to the next slide. Yet here's the thing that we're going to look at over the next couple of weeks. Tom Holland, not Spider-Man Tom Holland, by the way. Most of you would have known that. The other Tom Holland, who's had a very interesting faith journey, wrote a book called Dominion, The History of Christianity, and Why It's Changed the World. And Tom Holland, as a historian, was intrigued as to, and he still says this, he's still not convinced that the resurrection truly happened. He goes to church. He said, I heard him say it on Justin Brearley's show, The Surprising Rebirth of the Belief in God, just a few months ago. Tom Holland, the historian, says, I don't know if Jesus did rise from the dead. But the first Christians were totally convinced. And it changed everything. And he said, despite all you see, the West is still firmly tied to its Christian moorings. Because he travelled the world. He went to the places where terrible wars had happened in the Middle East, and he didn't see universal human rights. He saw something very different. And people like Tom Holland, and we'll look at Ayaan Hirsi Ali, the great public intellectual, have made big strides towards saying there's something about Christianity that sets things differently than any other cultural moment or cultural framework. The West is still firmly tied to its Christian moorings. In other words, we're not Christian in a kind of Christian way culturally. Even the people who are against Christianity, they can't help themselves. It's like they're going around their parents' house slamming the door saying, I'm in charge, but it's their parents' house. Do you get what I'm saying? They're squatting on land they didn't purchase. It's a big issue. Ros Ward, who was and still is, was the head of the Safe Schools Coalition that was being rolled out across schools around identity and gender, and works at La Trobe. Quite a Marxist, an interesting lady. She said this in The Guardian, I will never give up fighting for a more free and joyful world. Aren't those our words? Doesn't that feel like soon and very soon? See, even as a non-Christian in the West, someone like Ros Ward cannot loose herself from the idea that there's a time coming when things will be free and joyful. And do you know what that isn't? That isn't how the Greeks and Romans thought. It's not how people think Eastern philosophy. The Greeks and Romans believed that the golden era of the gods and the champions and the heroes was behind them. Eastern philosophy says it's doing this, going around in circles at some level. Where does the idea there's a free and joyful world come from? It's baked into the Bible because it started there and it's going there, and Jesus' resurrection is pushing it in that direction. Even Ros Ward, anti-Christian that she is, doesn't like Christian schools, uses totally marinated Christian ideas to push her ideas. Because once that's all that's left. You've got Jesus in the culture. And that's what I said before. What does it feel like? It feels like a home game versus an away game. Ros Ward will use language that we kind of think we own and use it for an away game against where we're coming from. And that's hard to navigate. What happens when the very tools and mechanics that you've created are taken and used against your framework? It's a big issue. We'll just skip forward to this one. It's good to see you all here tonight, because here's the other issue you're facing. Decline. There's a lot of young people here tonight. Well, everyone looks young to me these days, but you know, you're outliers in the West. That it isn't just the ideas that have changed, it's like church attendance has gone into free fall across the West. In the 2016 census, the No Religion campaign had a fantastic campaign. Do you see that? not religious anymore. Now, if they just had not religious, it would be like a slogan. But not religious anymore is a story. Do you remember that time you were religious? You had to wear itchy pants to church and someone preached for a long time. Pews. Well, you don't have to be religious anymore to still be a good Australian. You don't have to tick a box because you never go. It's okay. And 900,000 extra people ticked no religion in the 2016 census on the basis of this fact. And 900,000 extra in 2021 did the same. 1.8 million people ticked no religion across those two census data. Now, it's not like you were sitting there with the census data. Oh, the religious question, not religious. And yeah, I'm jacking it. I was there last Sunday teaching Sunday school, but gee, those kids were a pain. I'm done. Right? Look, if you're honest, you say that most weeks anyway, and you still turn up the next one, right? Pedagogy isn't what it used to be. It was just that, okay, we're tied to our Christian moorings, but that's it. That's okay. We don't need to do anything else about that. See, in 2011, Harold will be sitting in the lounge, and he's filling it in on the paper census data, census night, and he's going, Madge, what religion are we? And she go, hey, because, 80% of marriage is shouting what to the next room. But what religion are we? Californian. And he'd tick Californian. But they never went to the Californian church. They weren't married. They were married there, but the kids aren't going to be, and they're not going to be buried by them. So it is. Because perhaps, despite the fact that we've talked about all this hostility, it's apathy and inertia that's probably our biggest problem in the West. At least when I was growing up, I felt, please, couldn't someone at least be a little bit interested in anything we do? But no. Not religious anymore. What do you think 2026 will do? It'll add to that. Now, I'm going to stop in a second and talk about and give us time for questions, because I won't get through it all. But one of the things that we have to realise is the discombobulation and the rapid change is the technological changes in our world are vast in the last 30 years. How information moves is vast. AI is coming down the line at a rate of knots. Right? But how ideas move and who they move to has changed dramatically. Which is why I think with our younger cohort, especially since the smartphone, how we engage as a discipling community here is up against another discipling community, right? That's part of our issue that we're dealing with. It's not just that you're getting up to go to work in Babylon tomorrow morning at KPMG down there at Barangaroo, right? You carry Babylon around in your back pocket. And to think that a young influencer who's gender fluid in Portland can influence your 15-year-old today in Sydney. Because that's how information moves quickly. Ideas are moving and changing and then being outdated, and it's just this rapid, discontinuous change of the roller coaster. Ideas that took a long time to feed their way through an ecosystem of, academia, writing, thinking, that's all being bypassed by how technology works in our current climate. Those are the challenges we're facing as we think, what's next? Is there any chance of this slowing down a little bit? I would say not at this stage, but there is something happening. Humans have only got a limited capacity for how much they can sustain. Here's the good and bad news at the same time. There's a breaking point somewhere. Part of the anxiety of our current age, where people are starting to reflect on maybe that wasn't such a good idea, that road we went down, is because things are starting to break apart. The rise and failure of the modern self would seem a little bit more like where it's at. And that's good news and bad news. because people are starting to ask questions again. And I'm going to stop now because next week, if you come back for the second, this really drew you in, didn't it? Next week we'll look at future proof. Why I think the church could have its best couple of decades coming if we do things slightly differently, but with the same base. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for listening.